Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay. You're listening to the new Discourses podcast, and we're going to go back into the Book of Woke. I know we got a lot going on here at the podcast, just as a matter of a little bit of, housekeeping. We're doing a series on the Nazis, or Hitler, basically. We're doing a series on the Communist Manifesto. We got all kinds of other things going on. I'm writing book reviews, who knows. But I do have this Book of Woke thing going on, which is about the book called Critical Constructivism, written by Joe Kincheloe. It was published in 2005. Mr. Kincheloe died in 2008, I think, or 9, something like that. And so he's no longer with us, but I call this the Book of Woke because, in my opinion, it codifies woke. And I've already done 2 episodes in this kind of Book of Woke series. I don't have to tell you the whole story, but the long and short of it is that way back, and I mean like in 2016 or 17, I was trying to communicate the problems of so-called social justice warriors to people. And I stumbled upon this Wikipedia entry talking about something called critical constructivist epistemology, credited to one Joe Kincheloe. And I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is the thing. Then later I find out there's a book by Kincheloe called Critical Constructivism detailing the entire idea. I start calling it the Book of Woke. I can't get my hands on it. I can't find a copy. Not easily. And finally, our friend Logan Lansing manages to get a copy, which I still hold in my hands. So it's not an easy book to get, and I'm grateful that he's allowed me to borrow it apparently indefinitely. And I've done 2 episodes talking about critical constructivism so far, and in both episodes I've kind of alluded to, but I've never actually just done this. So I decided a good episode would be to just do this. At the beginning of the book, in the very opening part of chapter 1, Kincheloe gives a summary of constructivism or critical constructivism, and he gives it in these 11 bullet points. And I can just go through these 11 bullet points, and I don't have to get all elaborate on this. It's a couple of pages. And then throughout the book, this is why I haven't done it, he says there are 12 kind of key points. I don't know why there's 11 and then there's 12. There are 12 kind of key points that define critical constructivism, which, let me reiterate, critical constructivism is woke. Critical constructivism is woke. I'm not the least bit non-specific about what I mean by that word. I'm not using it casually. I'm not using it as slang. I'm not using it as a slur. I'm not using it as a smear. It means something very specific, a way of viewing the world. Woke refers to having woke up to what? To critical constructivism. When you have woke up to critical constructivism, you have something called critical consciousness. So it's having woke up to critical consciousness. Why would you do that? What about constructivism, consciousness? Okay, so the word critical consciousness is Paulo Freire's adaptation. That's a Marxist educator. All of our kids go to Paulo Freire schools. It is his adaptation of class consciousness into the new neo-Marxist liberationist frame. I've described it this way before. That's the crucible in which woke was cooked. Okay? Critical consciousness can then take a lot of forms, and the various forms of identity politics that we're used to can all go in the crucible. It can be feminism, third wave radical feminism, or whatever, queer theory, critical race theory, fat studies, disability studies, crip theory, whatever you want, post-colonial theory, put them all in there. All these different identity studies that are all ultimately derived from Mao, partly because of Freire, partly because of Herbert Marcuse, who is also one of the other neo-Marxist founders of this line of thought that's taken over the Western intelligentsia and university system, cooked in a crucible called critical consciousness, to awaken to any consciousness of any of those things under the doctrine or practice, as they have it, of intersectionality, is to have critical consciousness. So you have a critical consciousness of any of those things, and you have a critical consciousness roughly of all of them. But a critical consciousness is just this weird extension into a much wilder and woollier and more idealistic form of class consciousness, which, if you go read Freire and you read George Lukács with History and Class Consciousness, you can put that together pretty readily. I covered that, I think, in a very important chapter in the Marxification of education. So you can go read that or listen to that or whatever it is you do to get the sense of that. So anyway, Why am I talking about Paulo Freire? Because Paulo Freire had some students who were Westerners, not from Brazil. They were North Americans. One of them was named Henry Giroux. One of them was named Joe Kincheloe, who also studied with Giroux. And so Kincheloe developed this idea of critical constructivism to explain the contents of the critical consciousness, not just in terms of its identity politics, nuts and bolts, but in terms of the, in his own words, literal worldview that it describes. Okay, so when I say this is the book of woke, I'm not talking about slang. I'm not talking about the fact that the word came from African American slang for whatever. It doesn't matter. The way we use the word woke now, referring to something that I call socio-Gnosticism. If we're on the left, we would call it woke Marxism or wokeism or wokeness. All of those things that we're used to from left-wing identity politics in the last decades. When we're talking about that, what we're talking about is critical constructivism. That's how they view the world. I'm not going to bang on about the woke right in this podcast, but since I'm using the word, and that's why all of a sudden the word has become contentious, and the claim is that I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm just using it as a smear and a slur, and I'm not being specific, and it's just a vague word and doesn't mean anything, when I'm very, very, very clear. Here's a whole damn book about what it means that I keep reading to you from. How does woke right come about? Well, it turns out that woke right is derivative to woke. It is derivative to woke left. It is a reaction to woke left. It is taking up the same energy, the same tools, if you want. They've literally said this, by the way, that the neo-Marxist and postmodern tools were laying there and people with right-wing ambitions could pick them up. That is a close paraphrasing of a video from Carl Benjamin, the so-called Sargon of Akkad, that I've put on Twitter several times so that people can see that, yes, they really did say this. So they've taken up something like a reactionary critical constructivism to answer critical constructivism. It's not even just that they've picked up tactics or a victimhood mentality or reverse intersectionality, where now instead of the straight white Christian male being bad, the straight white Christian male is virtuous. It is that they, which is same energy, opposite direction, it is that they have onboarded the idea that truth is in fact at least partially, not quite as much for them, derivative to power, that might actually makes right, the ends are justifying of the means, and so on. Their view is woke. A lot of people don't like that the term fits. I hate that the term fits sometimes myself because everybody's so dyspeptic about it, but the term fits. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about them. People have been complaining, James, you try to do these podcasts about Book of Woke and you talk about the woke right. Well, it's a little salient right now and nobody's hearing it, so I'm trying to draw that out for people, but I'll be nice and try not to talk much about it. I'm just going to read to you a little bit from chapter 1 of this book, the very beginning. I'm going to read through to the end of those 11 points, which is, like I said, a couple pages. Then I'm going to go through the so-called 12 formal points of critical constructivism, which I've never done because they're not listed in one place. They're scattered throughout the book. But luckily, I went through and wrote them all down in one place, so I can go through them without having to flip through pages. So chapter 1 of this book, The Book of Woke, which is formally titled Critical Constructivism, a Primer by Joe L. Kincheloe, is titled From Constructivism to Critical Constructivism. Okay, so the critical part's really important. He says there's been a lot of talk and writing in the education profession over the last couple of decades about the nature of constructivism and its relationship to teaching and learning. Often, when I listen to individuals talk about the concept, I discern much confusion and misunderstanding. In this context, I offer this primer on constructivism and my particular, quote, take on it, critical constructivism. Throughout this volume, I will provide clear descriptions and definitions of a variety of concepts related to critical constructivism and show you how they relate to the teaching and learning processes. At the same time, I believe that education students and teachers are not sufficiently challenged in both their professional education and liberal arts and sciences classes, And in this context, I will offer some complex ideas. Okay, so notice that he's saying clearly that this is geared toward education professionals and students that will become them. The topic of constructivism, he says, is unalterably complex and cannot be made less so. Yeah, that's because it's guru baloney, but whatever. The purpose of this book, however, is to maintain the integrity and complexity of the topic while introducing the reader to it in a smart and accessible manner. I hope you find my efforts helpful. With these goals in mind, the book presents several major concepts about critical constructivism. Each of these points is directly connected to the inseparable acts of teaching and knowledge production. Let me pause here, because this is one of those things where the woke have to be understood. That phrase, knowledge production, it's not knowledge discovery. It's not knowledge comprehension. It's knowledge production. The woke believe, and yes, this applies to the woke right as well, that what we regard as truth or knowledge is something people make. We make it. In fact, it's downstream from power, because you have to have the power to get people to believe things in order to have something be treated as knowledge. So this is why they're always talking about ways of knowing or other ways of knowing or knowledges or marginalized knowledges or alternative knowledges, indigenous knowledges, feminist knowledges, critical race ways of knowing. This is all because they believe that knowledge is produced, and it is produced by particular people in particular places at particular times. In other words, what people consider knowledge is contingent to the group population. Now, I could go in on a long tangent here and talk about how this is all downstream from both Marx and Paulo Freire, that Freire gave a Marxist theory of knowledge. Certain people decided that they are going to be knowers, and they get to decide which knowledges count as knowledge, and they will intrinsically oppress people who do not, and they are the people who do not possess rigorous or valid or valued knowledges are marginalized and considered not to be knowers or considered to be ignorant or whatever it happens to be. This is exactly what Paulo Freire created, was a Marxist theory of knowing and knowledge. But the fact is that they believe that certain groups create knowledges, powerful, there is no other knowledge. There are just all these knowledges out there that are local artifacts of how groups think about the world. And then powerful groups dominate other groups by asserting that their knowledges are better than other people's knowledges, and the only ones that will be allowed. Of course, that's not because they are pointing at truths in a more effective or less effective way. This book, as you've heard before in the podcast, is particularly hostile to the scientific methodologies. It is that the groups create sets of knowledges to maintain their own group identity and practices, and that when that group has a standing in power, which is called a privileged positionality, it will use its status as powerful to contour the so-called knowing field, what people believe they know and don't know, to make their produced knowledges treated as though they are universal knowledges, thus marginalizing the knowledges of other groups and the other groups' other ways of knowing. So knowledge is produced artificially by groups or organically by groups, and that knowledge is treated incorrectly as true or indicative of truth for whatever sets of reasons, but the reasons ultimately boil down to power. And so marginalized groups do not have the power to make other groups believe their knowledges are knowledge, and powerful groups and dominant groups do. That's what makes them dominant. Therefore, knowledge production is something that's at the very center of how they think about the world. And the woke architecture overall, as we're going to hear as we go through these 11 points in this part, which we're almost to, it's just a short introduction. The woke view overall is that dominant groups use the status of having created knowledge to say that other groups don't believe the correct stuff and therefore can't have access to the table. They can't sit at the table of power. Okay, so they're marginalized, whereas the powerful groups' sets of knowledges are at the center and exclude and marginalize the other ways of knowing and alternative knowledges. You follow me so far? So feminists believe that men have created patriarchal knowledges that denigrate women, relegate them to the second sex, don't research women properly, etc. We've heard all of these things even recently on social media if you're following and paying attention. Michelle Obama recently said that one of the reasons that, it's such a big problem as a woman is because women are less studied, their knowledges and intuition are not respected by the male system. So this trope hasn't gone away. Critical race theorists have their own unique knowledges of racism. We saw that cause the utter meltdown against Bret Weinstein at the Evergreen State College, very famously in 2017, and I think 16 or 17. So you know about that. And these indigenous knowledges, blah, blah, blah. We could go down the whole list. The idea is that there's outside knowledge that is being excluded by dominant knowledge. Bret Weinstein was attacked at Evergreen for saying he wanted to help the students fight racism, but he wanted to see evidence of this racism. And he was told that asking for evidence of racism is itself racism, that the students didn't need to bring him evidence of racism because they live it. And if he wasn't white and therefore imbued with white privilege, he would have lived it too, and he wouldn't be asking. Therefore, this idea that his idea of evidence being relevant, I want to help you fight racism, show me the evidence of where it is and how it works, that is a dominant knowledge system that was produced by dominant white, Eurocentric, whatever you want, men to exclude things like critical race storytelling or feminist art or whatever else. This is the same model, by the way, that happens with the right wing also, with the conspiracy theory stuff. So it is true that some of the conspiracy theories that we have alleged are true, that they actually were trying to do this or that. They actually were lying to us about this or that, but it is not the case that all of them are true, or that something merely because it's a conspiracy is true. This woke thing is a preference for outside knowledge over official knowledge. Okay, or that's the beginning of it, because that's not the whole thing. It's not just a preference for outsider knowledge. And I've changed from outside to outsider there intentionally. It's a subtle point. It is a preference for something, I have to be more specific here, called counter-hegemony. Okay, so the belief in woke, which comes from Antonio Gramsci, the cultural Marxist, the father of cultural Marxism. Antonio Gramsci believed that the culture of capitalism produces a capitalist hegemony. Hegemony is what you have when you have, say, a regional power, right? That's more powerful than all of its neighbors. Imagine you're looking at Europe or whatever, and say the Germans, for whatever reason, are the most powerful and control the region of, say, continental Europe. That means Europe is operating under German hegemony. That's what hegemony means. It's like who has the general say over everything. Most of the world has been operating under U.S. hegemony for a number of years. One of the biggest fights in the world right now, which you'll hear under the phrase multipolar world, is that there is a deliberate attempt to wrest away from the United States hegemony and to spread it to more than one pole, rather than U.S. hegemony throughout the world, which would be unipolar, one pole. We're going to have multipolar power dynamics instead. So Russia becomes a major power, China becomes a major power, the US is still a major power, Europe is a major power. Now we have multipoled power, so those powers can compete with one another, and so on. What everybody who's got half of a brain can tell is that this is a way to take the liberty-minded country off the frickin' table and to allow the raising of the oligarchical tyranny of Russia, which might still have communist themes running through it, and the explicitly communist and fascist or communo-fascist, whatever you want, Chinese CCP model. So they are not in control, and they want to be in control. And step one to going from not in control to in control is to say we're all partly in control, and then to take over. So when you hear pundits push for a multipolar world, just realize that step one of a small number, 2 or 3 steps to getting the CCP in charge of how the whole world is run. It's called the Century of Asia. You should look it up. It's a real plan. Okay, like I said, some of the conspiracy theories are real. But when you have this idea that there is a hegemony, and that's the people in control of the hegemony get to produce the knowledges, the people outside of the hegemony are not necessarily woke. Woke means realizing that this hegemonic force exists, that it is defining of society, and that it is a problem. It's not the outsider knowledge like a conspiracy theory or a traditional medicinal remedy or even a superstition or myth. It's not that they never are true or partially true. It's that with counter-hegemony, the idea that Gramsci had was that you have the prevailing, what Foucault later called truth regime, and then something from the outside of that can destabilize or attack it. It's not evaluating, let's use the example of Chinese medicine real quick, or indigenous medicine. It's not coming across some herb that nobody's ever heard of before that's been used in, say, traditional medicine for 2,000 years to treat, I don't know, headache or worms or whatever. And then saying, well, does it work? Let's test it and find out. Let's do a, placebo-controlled, double-blinded study and see if it actually does that. Oh, wow, we find out that it does. Why does it do that? Let's analyze its chemical constituents and see if we can isolate which ones actually are the ones that are accomplishing this. Oh, it's this particular molecule in conjunction with that particular molecule that seem to be doing it. Well, can we refine those and turn them into a drug? And does that drug have the proper characteristics that we were looking for as a cure? And then let's do a placebo-controlled, double-blind study or clinical trial study on actual patients to see if it actually addresses the issue. It's nothing like that. That is not what we're talking about. Okay, that is the indigenous knowledge there is not counter-hegemonic. What the kind of Marxist mentality or the woke mentality would say is, in fact, that the Western hegemonic model just co-opted some indigenous model and stripped it of all of its authenticity so that it could co-opt it into the Western system and model. What we're talking about is some tribe sucked on some root for the last 2,000 years, said that it cures pregnancy or whatever the hell it is that it's supposed to cure. And I chose a nasty abortion example on purpose so that it would be shocking to you, and use the word cure pregnancy on purpose so that it would be shocking to you. I think something about carrot seeds is alleged to do that. Don't do that at home, by the way. It's not a good idea. But at any rate, we'll say that there's some indigenous group somewhere that sucked on some root for whatever, and it's cured whatever ailment for years. And so now the idea of the counter-hegemony isn't even just that you have to accept this and just suck on the root and maintain the tradition. It's in fact that if you don't maintain the tradition, you've done some great harm to the group. And in fact, that you are supposed to use that belief to upset the prevailing scientific model. You are to say that it is racist to engage in, or colonialist, or imperialist, or Eurocentric, or whatever, to engage. It is some imposition to engage that belief in the scientific process at all. As a matter of fact, you probably can't just buy the root and make a tea and drink it or suck on it or whatever you're supposed to do, or chew on it. You probably have to have it properly produced in the right ceremony by a elder or some fat blue-haired lesbian who's operating as their representative, who learned it at a retreat where they got scammed by some dude in another country who pretended to be more indigenous than he is. And so anyway, which, by the way, that just shows you there's a ton of graft and fraud and everything else baked into this kind of non-rigorous approach to everything. So counter-hegemonic means that it has to be outside of what's considered to be the dominant or prevailing way of understanding things, but it also must be against it. It must challenge, upset, disrupt, dismantle, or unthrone it. Okay, so when I say the woke right and the woke left both do this, the woke left does this by calling everything racist. The woke left does this by calling everything heteronormative. Oh, that's just heteronormative knowledge that prevents queerness from emerging. That's just racist knowledge that doesn't allow for an anti-racist society. And the radical right says that's what they don't want us to know so that they can keep forcing whatever system on us, the post-war consensus or whatever it happens to be. They don't want you to know this. Therefore, we're going to say it specifically to disrupt the prevailing understanding and order, or in other words, cultural hegemony. So woke means that you're going to use produced knowledges outside of and specifically to attack the prevailing dominant group vision, ideology, knowledge system, whatever it happens to be, cultural stability, everything. The whole gamut of cultural hegemony is going to be upset by the activities of the woke outsider who is outside and against. So that's the key here. The whole point is to disrupt the believability of the dominant knowledge system, even if the reason the dominant knowledge system is dominant is because it actually works. In other words, that it has high fidelity to reality, as demonstrated through, say, explanatory power, predictive power, in particular predictive power, and so on, as you might have through a demonstration of a double-blinded, peer-reviewed clinical trial. How is that predictive, by the way? Because you can predict if somebody has a headache and they take aspirin, the headache will probably go away. That's why it's predictive. Okay, that was a long digression, a really long one, but it's super important to understand. Again, I'm not being at all glib with how I'm using the word woke. It is not a smear. It is a very specific thing. It is having adopted a counter-hegemonic attitude to hegemonic knowledge traditions, at least in the sense of critical constructivism. This book explains why woke people think this way and what it entails. It is a worldview, as we've talked about before. It uses critical hermeneutics, which means it's adopting a critical theory approach. And it is ultimately, as this part of the book is explaining, constructivist. Knowledge is produced. It is constructed by groups. And as we're going to hear, the way it's done is through power. I carry on now. Thus, Kincheloe tells us, critical constructivism is constantly concerned about research and pedagogy in the multiple ways they are connected. Pedagogy is a theory of teaching, by the way, and the practice of teaching. Over the next 5 chapters, I will delineate these dimensions of critical constructivism one by one. Written in this manner, the book can be viewed as a whole or as separate parts to be read independently. The points fit together synergistically, as understanding one concept will enhance your understanding of the others. Writing this book in this manner is not designed to fragment the concept of critical constructivism, but to give those new to the concept better access to its main dynamics. You can even hear the guru mechanism there, right? It's all complicated. We're not going to fragment it, but it's hard to understand. It's intrinsically complicated. So I'm going to break it down, but it really shouldn't be broken down because I'm still going to be your guru that can guide you through when you're doing it right and wrong. Here are the main ideas of the book, and this is the 11 points. I'm not going to elaborate tons on these, but I'm going to touch on them each, and then we're going to talk about the 12 things that he actually calls the points or pillars of critical constructivism. First thing he says here, these are bullet points, not numbers, so I'm not going to try to keep up with the numbers because I'll get lost. The world is socially constructed. So that which we know, not just that, but the world itself is constructed through social processes. That's actually what the constructivist thesis is. The world is socially constructed. He says, what we know about the world always involves a knower and that which is to be known. How the knower constructs the known constitutes what we think of as reality. So none of us have access to reality. Do you understand? That's incredibly important to this view. The woke view, we don't have access to reality as it is. We have a construction of reality that we create according to our understanding of reality as we see it. Okay? The world is socially constructed. He says next, All knowers are historical and social subjects. Now, if you're a long-time listener to New Discourses podcast, when you heard the word historical, your Marxist fox ears popped up and you're like, okay, I know what we're dealing with. All knowers are historical and social subjects. We all come from a somewhere, they call that a positionality, by the way, which is located in a particular historical time frame. These spatial and temporal settings always shape the nature of our constructions of the world. Now, I'm going to read to you something from Karl Marx real quick, a very short quote. But first, I just want to point out to you that this here that he just pulled is a little bit of a lie. We all come from somewhere, some particular place and time. So maybe you're from Tennessee in the 1990s. So you think about the world in a particular way because you're contingent to a location and a time and a people or whatever. No, this is called lying. This is called lying. So you'll say that makes sense and then believe the thing they really want you to believe. That makes sense. I am from a particular time and a place. So is everybody else. What he actually means when he says a location is a positionality, which means a position in the social power hierarchy. It is your position in the social power hierarchy that determines what you know and how you know it. That's partially contingent on time and place. I'm not saying it's zero, but there are two things here, and he's presenting one which you will not object to in order to get you to buy the other one later. And that other one is that you are actually a product of a position within the social power hierarchy that limits what you can know and how you think. We are the products of that. Marxism called this material determinism because it was materialist in the sense that your material conditions were deterministic of who you were and what you could think. Later, constructivists called this structural determinism, that the structure of the society and even the language that it speaks and the knowledge system that you are embedded in around you constrains how you can see yourself and understand yourself. And that in turn is actually dependent on where you're located in the power hierarchy. Are you rich? Are you poor? Are you marginalized? Are you privileged? All of that has a major effect on what you can know, what you think you can know, and so on. Even how you can think and who you are. You are, in fact, the product of your circumstances. So where did this idea come from? Karl Marx. Okay, so Karl Marx in 1852 wrote the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and he has right from the beginning this extremely famous line, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." That's the same idea. So where did Kincheloe get this? Marx. This is Marxism. Constructivism is downstream from the Marxist view. They can argue that, no, it comes from this existentialist. Shut up. You're downstream from Marxism. You just got a little more Rousseau in you. Okay. The next point Kincheloe gives, not only is the world socially and historically, Marxist watchword, constructed, but so are people and the knowledge people possess. So people being constructed is structural determinism, which I just told you about, which comes from the quote from Marx I just read to you. Okay. But they're also the knowledge people possess. So that's what Paulo Freire did. Paulo Freire created the Marxist theory of knowledge and knowing. So all of a sudden, the knowledge people possess becomes situated in the same way. It is in fact constructed, and it is in fact contoured by your position in the social power hierarchy and what you know and who's considered a knower versus who's considered ignorant. He says, we create ourselves. Well, that's a bold statement, isn't it? And I think you should take him literally. Do not think of this as him being cute. They literally believe that we are our own creators. I could go back and read to you from Marx again, I've read it a dozen times, so I'm not going to do it again, but Marx in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right from 1843, right? We create ourselves, he says. with the cultural tools at hand. We operate and construct the world and our lives on a particular social, cultural, and historical playing field. Let me read this from Marx again. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under the circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. In case you're wondering what this is about. So we're slaves to the circumstances that we're in. They constrain everything that we can know and do. And so he says we create ourselves with the cultural tools at hand. We operate and construct the world and our lives on a particular social, cultural, and historical playing field. It's the exact same sentiment. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. So this is the flungness or thrownness that Heidegger talked about, because Heidegger was a Gnostic, because this is a Gnostic view. You've been flung into a set of circumstances, a socio-Gnostic or social Gnostic or sociological Gnostic view. You've been flung into a set of circumstances. You didn't choose them. They delimit like you are imprisoned, and the goal is to recreate or create yourself to liberate yourself from them. Literally, that is the Gnostic disposition. It is knowing who we are and into what we have been thrown, where we come from, and to where we may return. That is Theodotus, I think, or Theodotus, talking about, talking about what Gnosticism represents. He was a 2nd century Gnostic, by the way. Kinchelo goes on. A key aspect of education in this context involves understanding the nature of these constructions. In the realm of knowledge, the epistemological domain, it is simple-minded and misleading to merely study random outcomes of the construction process, isolated facts and truths. Facts and truths are both in scare quotes because they don't believe in those. There are no such universals in the universe. Constructivists, he says, are as much concerned with the processes through which certain information becomes validated knowledge as with committing lots of it to memory. Maybe it comes through, the establishment. Maybe the establishment is repressive and maybe the establishment is leftist. I don't know, but maybe it comes through the establishment and leads you to believe something false. So constructivists are as much concerned with the processes through which certain information becomes validated knowledge as with committing lots of it to memory. They are also concerned with the processes through which certain information was not deemed to be worthy of validated knowledge. So what processes make some knowledge valid and other knowledge marginalized? Notice it's all knowledge in his consideration. No measure whatsoever if it corresponds to reality. There are no facts or truth. And how did it get that way? I'll give you 2 guesses as to what he thinks the answer is. The power in the dominant groups that are the people who are making history. He says the teaching and learning process is intimately connected to the Research Act. Thus, throughout this book, I will blur these categories and consistently examine knowledge production and research at the same time I am analyzing teaching and learning. A key dimension of critical constructivism involves the complex interrelationship between teaching and learning and knowledge production and research. Next point, when critical constructivists produce knowledge, notice that now the critical constructivists are producing knowledge, and by producing knowledge, they are creating themselves and their world. When critical constructivists produce knowledge, they are not attempting to reduce variables, but to maximize them. There's a weird citation in the location there. Such maximization produces a thicker, more detailed, more complex understanding of the social, political, economic, cultural, psychological, and pedagogical world. So when it's really complex, they get to be in charge. Thus, he says, and we kind of get to the point, the purpose of education in this critical constructivist process is not to transmit a body of validated truths to students, so it's not to teach them things for memorization. Instead, critical constructivists argue that a central role of schooling involves engaging students in the knowledge production process. A central dimension of teaching in this context involves engaging students in analyzing, interpreting, and constructing a wide variety of knowledges emerging from diverse locations. Are you starting to get the idea? Again, locations here is going to refer to not like Japan, Korea, Canada, and Florida. No, the diverse, or 17th century versus 20th century. No, the locations are going to be in terms of social, political power. Critical constructivists, he tells us, are concerned with the exaggerated role power plays in these constructions and validation processes. And so there you have it. Critical constructivists are particularly interested in the ways these processes help privilege some people and marginalize others. Of course, through what? Through their knowledges and the knowledge validation processes. Critical constructivists, he says, reiterate the notion that knowledge is not a substance that can be deposited like money in a bank, citing Paulo Freire's idea of the so-called banking model of education. 1970 would be pedagogy of the oppressed. And he says, taken out for when, so deposited and taken out for when time, really does say that. Let me see. Okay, let me just do the sentence again. Critical constructivists reiterate that the notion that knowledge is not a substance that can be deposited like money into a bank and taken out when time for its use arises. In this transmissive theory of knowledge, information is transferred from the teacher to the pupil's mind. In the critical constructivist formulations, knowledge is constructed in the minds of human beings. Minds that are constructed by the society around them. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under the circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. The knowledge of the classroom, Kinchelo goes on, is constructed where students' personal experience, there's your lived experience, intersects with academic knowledges. No longer one, academic knowledges. So this is going to be all of your Marxian theories or neo-Marxist theories, like critical race theory, feminist theory, and so on. A key skill of a critical constructivist teacher involves nurturing the synthesis of personal experience and academic knowledge. So this is part of the counter-hegemony thing, right? You are a marginalized person. You might be a racial minority, a sexual minority, a heritage American, or whatever. You're a marginalized person, and it's up to you to understand how you actually get to construct knowledge, but in line with the counter-hegemonic theory that the teacher is teaching you. A key skill of a critical constructivist teacher involves nurturing the synthesis of personal experience and academic knowledge. Such a pedagogical act is extremely complex, and teachers must work hard to bring the different perspectives together. They reveal how their own perspective came to be constructed and how the social values, ideologies, and information they encounter shape their pedagogies and worldviews. And lastly, he says, in their search for ways to produce democratic and evocative knowledges, democratic and evocative. What are we talking about here? Democratic means everybody. Okay? Democratic means everybody. That means not just the people in the hegemonic power center, but everybody, which means democratic knowledges means not just the established knowledge, and in fact, preferably not the established knowledge, but the counter-hegemonic outsider knowledge. That's just outsider knowledge, marginalized knowledge, if we can even use the word knowledge for that, is democratic. But we're not looking at just democratic knowledges. He says democratic and evocative knowledges. And so there's your counter-hegemonic element where you're going to use your democratic and evocative outsider knowledges to do critique of the existing system, he says. So in their search for ways to produce democratic and evocative knowledges, critical constructivists become detectives of new ways of seeing and constructing the world. Maybe they believe conspiracy theories like critical race theory's belief in systemic racism always causing racism that you can't ever quite get rid of. It's not, as Robin DiAngelo told us, did racism take place, but rather how did racism manifest in this situation? You have to be a detective to find it out. Or maybe it's you're being a detective of what they, the intelligence communities maybe, who knows, don't want you to know. Israel certainly doesn't want you to know a lot of things, right? I'm sure we're just asking questions. That way you can make your own judgments, right? We're just going to have more democratic and very evocative knowledges to allow you to ask more questions and answer more questions for yourself outside of the, prevailing narratives that tell us how we're supposed to think because they don't want you to know these things. That's woke, guys. In this context, he wraps up, they come to value knowledges and forms of meaning-making traditionally dismissed by dominant culture and mainstream academics. Like conspiracy theories, like I said. In this subjugated context, they use the African-American blues idiom to construct blue knowledge. Okay, so I will confess that nobody that I'm aware of has ever called it that, except for him. It's like this nearly last part of the book would be really great to read, except that it's so centered on this and talks about blues music so much that it is very hard to communicate what he's doing, so it's kind of a wash. So nobody really used that term, but the idea, what he means by blue knowledge is counter-hegemonic ideas and knowledges and ways of knowing. The point of the counter-hegemony is to upset the current system. It doesn't matter which angle it takes. Feminism, queer theory, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, globalize the intifada, conspiracy theory. They don't want you to know this. What about the Jews? Doesn't matter what form it takes. The point is, how do you construct a knowledge, an outsider, marginalized knowledge system that by the questions it asks and answers it gives attacks the believability, the credibility of the existing so-called hegemonic system, because there is no truth, there are no facts, there is no knowledge. Knowledge is socially constructed. It is constructed by different groups for different reasons, and some of those reasons might be liberation from the existing system, and some of those reasons might be to maintain the existing system. That conflict between the people who wish to maintain the existing system, the privileged or the oppressor, and the people who wish to be liberated from it, the oppressed or the marginalized, is called Marxism or woke. Okay, so that's woke. Okay, so like I said, Kincheloe gives 12 defining points of critical constructivism, and they are strewn throughout the book. They are not easy. They're nowhere are they just listed. So I'm going to go, I've gathered them all for you here in one place, and the rest of the podcast is just going to be to go through these. It won't take super long. They're only 12. I'm going to talk about them a little bit each. But I just want you to hear from the Book of Woke what woke is. Okay, so critical constructivism. Point 1. Critical constructivism is grounded on the notion of constructivism. Constructivism asserts that nothing represents a neutral perspective. Who have you heard saying that? That there is no neutral, say in education, that there is no neutral ground on which to stand. Nothing is value neutral. Think as many people as you can, wherever you find them in politics. Who have you heard saying that? Critical constructivism is grounded on the notion of constructivism. Constructivism asserts that nothing represents a neutral perspective. Nothing exists before consciousness shapes it into something perceptible. So one consequence of this belief is there is no shared reality, and therefore all perception of reality is contoured by your social position, which means actually all perception of reality is political. Therefore, all knowledge of reality is political and contingent upon where you land in the social political hierarchy. Okay, but let me just drive that nail in harder. I really want you to think of everybody you've heard, and yes, you've heard them on the left, and yes, you've heard them on the right. Constructivism asserts that nothing represents a neutral perspective. Everybody who has accepted that has accepted the fundamental tenet of constructivism, which is the underlying premise of woke. The only thing that keeps constructivism from being woke is that it's not a power analysis yet. So once it goes into analyzing a class conflict in society, and it holds that nothing is neutral, everything is part of the class conflict in society, you're woke. That's all woke means. Once again, it is not a smear, it is not a slur, it is not vague, it is not a meaningless term, it is not even slang. That's what it means. Constructivism asserts that nothing represents a neutral perspective. Nothing exists, which, by the way, that's a profound ontological statement. Nothing exists before consciousness shapes it into something perceptible. And like I said, when I wrote these down in one place, by the way, I was writing about the trans issue for a court as an expert witness. So I added the note that means that the constructivists do not believe that there's a shared reality because all reality is a matter of perception and all perception is political. Okay, critical constructivism point 2. Knowledge of the world, remember, none of it's neutral. It's all value-laden. Knowledge of the world is an interpretation produced by people who are part of that world. Thus, understanding the nature of the interpretation is a central feature of being an educated person. So that means that knowledge is not some body of facts. It's not true statements. They don't believe in those things that correspond to features of some shared reality, which they don't believe we have, because reality is downstream from perception, and perception is downstream from political conditions. What was the Marx quote? Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. So that's how they make their knowledges. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So knowledge is not some body of facts corresponding to features of some shared reality. It is merely an interpretation of the world by people who are part of that world, which they have to do intrinsically in a politicized way that is grounded in their positionality, because they are structurally determined by that position against the social and political hierarchy, which is not value neutral. Critical constructivism point 3. Interpretations cannot be separated from an interpreter's location in the web of reality. One's interpretive facility involves understanding how historical, social, cultural, economic, and political contexts construct our perspectives of the world, self, and others. So there it is, right there. What I just explained to you is right there, next point. Okay, your location in the web of reality. Remember earlier I said this is what we call a lie, and I said it's not totally a lie, it's just mostly a lie. Location can mean literally where you are, like geography, and when you are, and what the culture there is. But it can also mean under your historical conditions like Marx meant it, or your social position as the intersectionalists use it. Are you a marginalized minority? Are you a dispossessed heir of society who has lost your social standing because of too much tolerance? Where are you politically? Historical, social, cultural, economic, and political contexts construct our perspectives of the world, self, and others. So we are structurally determined by the conditions we find ourselves in, which I guess weigh on the brains of the living like a nightmare. So all knowledge in critical constructivism, or woke, is an expression of politics as understood through the constructivist notion of positionality with regard to one's relationship to the prevailing power relations said to construct reality. So the power relations, the oppressor versus oppressed conflicts are all determining. They construct reality itself, and everybody in society, so believe the woke, understands reality, constructs their own reality, as a matter of fact, relevant to where they are in the power hierarchy. So thus a person in a oppressed position will occupy a completely different reality than a person in a privileged or oppressor position. Point number 4 of critical constructivism, according to Joe Kinchelow, the critical in critical constructivism comes from critical theory and its concern with extending a human's consciousness of herself as a social being. Critical theory promotes self-reflection in relation to social power and its ability to align our self-perceptions and worldviews with the interests of power blocks. See, it's just about understanding how power works, right? And how power works in society in reality in order to, contour what you're able to do and understand. And our goal is to use critique to critique the existing structures or to attack them with counter-hegemonic ideas in order to extend the human's consciousness of herself as a social being. That's all going to be done self-reflectively by what? In relation to social power, by contemplating how power works in the social and political domain, but also how it aligns our perceptions. Okay? So that which constructs reality for different parties under critical constructivism is said to be the oppressive power dynamics that we're all stuck living in, as they are identified and analyzed specifically by who? Critical theorists, which is to say critical Marxists in theory and practice. And understanding this is deemed to be a kind of awakening to some higher order understanding of reality. That's what it means to be woke. And it doesn't have to be leftist critical theory. There is right-wing critical theory. There is right-wing dialectics as well. Reno's book, Return of the Strong Gods, has literally right-wing dialectic that's borrowed directly from the critical theorists. Critical constructivism, point number 5. The key elements of a rigorous education involve understanding how our consciousness is constructed, subjectively shaped, and identity produced. Here rests the theoretical key to critical constructivism, the role of power in these processes of self-production and in turn epistemology and knowledge production. I don't know how it could be more clear. If you believe that there is a system of power that is constructing people and epistemology and knowledge, then you're probably woke. In other words, oppressive political power is central to what it means to know, which is to say what it means to understand reality. And then to understand reality is a matter of perceiving reality, which is downstream of the political power, like I already explained. Point number 6. In this context, critical constructivists begin to raise questions about these constructive processes, there's your counter-hegemonic just asking questions, and their relations to power and its influence on the pedagogical processes, informal cultural pedagogy, informal school pedagogy. Here, questions of the purposes of schooling in a democratic society begin to emerge. Now, he's very focused. He's an educator writing an education book, so he's very focused on pedagogy and education. But the fact of the matter is that you learn not just in schools. You learn from media, you learn from podcasts, you learn from, you can go into like political conferences, from listening to speeches, from all kinds of things, from social media, alt media also, right? So schooling has to be thought of, a little bit more abstractly, especially now with social media and all that. But we're raising questions, there's your counter-hegemonic activity, about these constructive processes and their relations to power and its influence on how we learn about the world that we're in. So if we believe that the fake news media is lying and the fake news alt media is telling the truth, we're dangerously in the position of kind of very lightly leaning woke. If you're constantly interrogating that, not just calling out CNN for its lies or MSNBC for its lies or Fox or any of them or New York Times, like when they lie. But if you're basing the idea that something that is outside of that is more likely to be true because it's outside of that, then you're in a dangerous position. You might not be woke yet, but woke lives that way. What letter is G? I have these by letters, not numbers. So point number 7. Critical constructivism illustrates how Cartesian, this one's a little bit in the weeds. Critical constructivism illustrates how Cartesian epistemology promotes the notion of the abstract individual. Now imagine that there was some group that went around complaining that one of the biggest problems is that the individual is considered in an abstract way rather than in a concrete way, where the concrete way is through their group identity. Wonder who would do that. Can you think of anybody who would say something like that? Critical constructivism illustrates how the Cartesian epistemology promotes the notion of the abstract individual, an independent agent free from the constructed influences of the social, political, cultural, economic, and historical dimensions of the world. The modernist European concept of self, the rise and triumph of the modern self or something, cannot withstand these insights. It is hard in this context to determine where the individual ends and the social begins. So, in other words, critical constructivism rejects the idea of individuals living in a discernible shared reality in favor of arriving at truths through social consensus, which are either organic or manufactured. But listen to that. The notion of the abstract individual, an independent agent, free from the constructed influence of the social, political, cultural, economic, and historical dimensions of the world. Okay. Woke thinks that that's what the dominant Eurocentric Cartesian model gives us. And that what we need is to understand that we're actually peoples embedded in communities and places that have their own knowledges and traditions and ways of knowing and approaching the world that have been marginalized by this dominant globo-homo or whatever it's called, and that must therefore engage in counter-hegemonic activity in order to free ourselves from it and rediscover what it means to be fully human. Just saying. Point 8. Critical constructivists avoid reductionism and the naive realism that accompanies it. Critical constructivist educators make sure that education does not serve as a force that indoctrinates and stupefies rather than engages and enlightens. I'm just not gonna do it again. So that wasn't that complicated, right? Avoiding reductionism. We don't want to make everything, down to, simple, cut and dry science. We wouldn't want to live in a disenchanted world. Naive realism. There's more to life than a naive realism. It's not just what we can prove is, scientifically accurate, blah, 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 right? And we wouldn't want our education to indoctrinate and stupefy. We want it to engage and enlighten. Remember, nothing's value neutral, so it will engage and enlighten according to our values. But we also should just note that woke or critical constructivism is therefore also hostile to the scientific methods and its conclusions, which are deemed to indoctrinate and stupefy according to the prevailing modes of power that force us to accept them. Critical constructivist point number 9. Critical constructivists assert that understanding the positioning of the researcher in the social web of reality is essential to the production of rigorous and textured knowledge. See, who you are is important to understanding what you say. Your words cannot properly be comprehended without knowing from what social perspective or positionality you come from. Okay, so critical constructivists assert that understanding the positioning, there's your positionality, your where are you in the power hierarchy of the researcher in the social web of reality. Are you part of the establishment? Are you white? Are you straight? Whatever, is essential to the production of rigorous and textured knowledge. As long as researchers and consumers of knowledge do not understand where they themselves and other researchers stand in the social web, scholars will have a thin and distorted conception of the research process and the data it produces. Now, of course, corollary to this is that critical constructivists intrinsically regard its claims to knowledge as superior to other claims of knowledge, right? That's one thing. But this idea that we have to understand the positioning of the researcher in the social web of reality, you're like, well, that's clearly something the left does. They care. Are you a black woman? Are you a whatever? But I don't know if you've talked to a Christian nationalist. But if you disagree with them and you're not Christian, good luck. Critical constructivism, point 10. In the critical constructivist process of reconstructing the self, humans are ethically required to search in as many locations as possible for unique ideas, alternative discourses, new ways of thinking and being intelligent and producing knowledge, the explosive power of difference. Okay, so obviously the left and the right do vary here. But again, you're searching for that outside knowledge, and what you're going to do is figure out ways to turn it counter-hegemonic. But it's also, again, here's an indicator that what we're dealing with is a cult. I've said this a lot of times in the past. Critical constructivism is actually cult-like in that it seeks to reconstruct the self. Notice that in the critical constructive process of reconstructing the self. That's the whole thing, right? So our self is actually, whether you're left or right, the self has actually been atomized and destroyed and lost and alienated by the prevailing power dynamic. And what we have to do is reconstruct it by looking outside of that power dynamic in order to, find unique ideas, alternative discourses, new ways of thinking and being intelligent and producing knowledge in order to overcome that problem. Okay, and so I'm just aghast that people think that woke right is I'm not supposed to do this. It's supposed to be good. James, don't talk about the woke right in the podcast about the woke left. It's just so the same. I'm just shocked, I tell you. Critical constructivism point 11. Critical constructivism works to expose elitist assumptions embedded in existing knowledge. Understanding that dominant power wielders have attempted to hegemonize individuals via the development of these knowledges and the political, economic, social, cultural, epistemological, and pedagogical structures, many will be uncomfortable with the expose process. So they're against the existing elite because it's hegemonic, and we need counter-hegemony because the hegemony structurally determined the people according to its hegemonic forces. And people that have that exposed to them will be uncomfortable about it and won't like it. One thing that's not mentioned here is that, of course, I just talked about how their knowledges are intrinsically superior to others. They're more rigorous and textured or whatever the guy said. So their elite is better than your elite. It's just a matter of everything being not value neutral, with elites controlling things, and their elite, which pretends to be in the name of the people, is better than the other elite, which pretends to be in the name of the other people. But you get the idea here again that critical constructivist critiques of power are not only considered to be more valid than any other perspective, but in fact, if anybody protests against that, then that means that those perspectives must be invalid by the strictures of critical constructivism. Because people will be uncomfortable, that means they're disagreeing for emotional reasons, not for logical reasons. It's, they will, they can't possibly have a real objection. They just, don't want to let go of their comfortable assumptions. They just don't want to have to ask uncomfortable questions or look for their answers. They just don't like confronting the fact that maybe their history wasn't what they thought it was. The funny thing is I can say all these sentences literally like this, and you don't know if I'm thinking of the woke left or the woke right or both when I say them, because they apply. This is why I keep saying this word is correct, and not as a smear or a slur or a slang or anything. And last but not least, critical constructivism, point number 12, according to Joe Kinchelow in Critical Constructivism, a Primer, critical constructivists value subjugated knowledge. I don't know how many times I have to say that that's what they do, but subjugated here doesn't mean they just value it. They prefer what? Counter-hegemonic knowledges, counter-hegemonic activity, counter-hegemonic belief, counter-hegemonic practices, counter-hegemonic organizing, counter-hegemonic communities, which is why you have to have all these Muslim communities. It's why you have to have very politically black communities. It's why you have to have gay communities. It's why you have to have Christian nationalist communities. Critical constructivists value subjugated knowledge, using the concept of the blues idiom. Again, nobody did this but him, as far as I know. We attempt to expand the concept of subjugated knowledge by drawing upon an African-American cultural knowledges. The result is a form of subjugated epistemology called blue knowledge. And that's his last point. Like I said, I think he kind of ruins the last chapter by focusing on this weird idiom, but here we are. And anyway, what we can summarize there is, that which critical constructivist ideologies code as oppressed is more valid than whatever it codes as dominant. That's because it's intrinsically counter-hegemonic. That's the whole point. Woke means being counter-hegemonic. Critical constructivism alone claims the emancipatory authority, that's a Kinchlow word, to make such judgments as to what is valid, invalid, what is dominant, and which is marginalized. And so this is why nobody just asks questions. I know it's getting a little cliche to say that. Nobody just asks questions. They ask questions to get answers. And the point is that the questions and the answers that they're looking for, whether they are indigenous knowledges, feminist knowledges, or whatever it is Tucker Carlson and the Nazi apologist people are doing, they're all meant to tear away at the credibility of the existing system. In other words, they're meant to do counter-hegemonic activity that's all predicated off of the belief that knowledge is situated in people as a function of their political power, because, men make history. We should read it one more time, right? Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And so they create knowledges that represent the world that they perceive, where their perceptions are produced or contoured by the political power that they experience in a fundamentally segregated or stratified world of oppressor versus oppressed, insider versus outsider. So the outsider isn't just outside and different and its own, marching to the beat of its own drum. The drum that it's beating is a war drum back against the center. The goal is for the margin to push its way into the center and, in their own words, to de-center what they believe is there illegitimately. The belief is that dominant knowledge is only dominant not because it points to the truth or is true, but because it is there because the dominant groups have the power to make everybody believe it. And part of their motivation to do that as dominant groups is to keep alternatives out. That's the woke view. If you have that, I don't care if you're on the left, I don't care if you're on the right, I don't care if you're a critical government theorist libertarian. If you view knowledge and systems of understanding, perception, etc. that way, you are woke. Period. It is not a slang term. It is not a slur or a smear or just something vague that can be used to mean anything. It means something extremely specific. And here, reading the 12 points of critical constructivism, which is to say the 12 points of woke from the book that I call the Book of Woke, you get that impression. So thank you for joining me. A shorter episode than I usually do, thank goodness. And I will have more exciting content for you about left and right and wokeness overall coming soon. Talk to you soon.